from collecting human waste with bare hands, to softening clothes using bodily waste. If you think your job right now is unbearable, watch this video and see just how blessed you are. If you've had a bad day at work, this might help draw some of the sting. There have been some truly dreadful occupations throughout history, from the gross to the downright dangerous. The phrase, "it's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it," is fitting for many of these, and some show just how far people have had to go in the past to be able to feed themselves and their families. This is history rediscovered. Gruesome historical jobs that you won't believe existed. When it comes to horrible jobs in a castle, gong farmer has to win the prize. Gong farmers, also known as nightmen, were responsible for cleaning out human excrement from the cesspits within the castle walls. These unfortunate souls would then transport the waste outside the castle walls to pre-arranged locations where it was dumped and buried. Imagine this: you reassigned this dirty job by a noble. The streets are filled with dirt, mud, and the waste of humans and animals alike. You see piles of feces being thrown out a resident's window, onto the street. The stench is wretched, you want to vomit your entire soul out. A quick death would have been a better punishment. You desperately shovel the feces out of the street, in which you see maggots thriving. The pigs yearn for more food, and you shovel it down to them. A splotching noise lands on your ears, you hear the pigs ravaging the feces, but also that your foot feels moist. You've stepped in a pile of urine, human, animal feces and maggots. The maggots, cling to your feet, feasting off of your skin and the feces they were previously consuming. You come home, and sit down for a second, rethinking what just happened. Suddenly, you feel ill. The doctors are helping nobles, which leaves you, a poor peasant, unable to be treated. Hours pass, and you've caught a fever. It is as if the devil himself is trying to kill you. Cesspits, the medieval forerunner of the septic tank, were often located on the lowest level within a castle. The gong farmer would quite literally dig up weeks, months, even years' worth of excrement from the bottom of these pits. They were paid by the ton, giving some example of how much work they performed. Given the tight quarters they operated in, and the contents of what they were digging up, there were cases of gong farmers suffocating on the job. Unlike the rat catchers, gong farmers were not admired by society. The manner of their work, and surely their hideous smell, meant that most lived on society's fringes. You may be saying to yourself, "I adore gardening. Why was that work so terrible?" Well, the work of a medieval gardener was very dissimilar from that of a modern gardener. For starters, gardeners throughout the Middle Ages lacked contemporary tools. Do you need to cut the grass? Only a scythe or primitive shears were available, no lawnmower. Do the flowers need watering? No hoses were allowed, water had to be hauled in pails from the closest well or stream. The frequent need to manually cut and weed the gardens broke up the physically taxing task. Since there were no synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, every plant was prized greatly. In order to stop further losses, a diseased or infected plant required to be removed right away. A medieval gardener had numerous, fun, side jobs in addition to the laborious manual labor in the actual garden. The gardener at a castle was in charge of scaling the perilous walls to get rid of vines or other vegetation that might aid an invading enemy. It goes without saying that many gardeners who were carrying out this duty collapsed and were either paralyzed or died as a result. Digging ditches that could be utilized for waste management, cemeteries, or defense was another duty. Leech collectors. Well, it turns out that leech collectors did exactly what you'd expect them to do for a living. Disease was common in the Middle Times, and doctors held to the Greek belief that illness was brought on by an imbalance of the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Bloodletting's advantages as a treatment and a prophylactic strategy won over many people. Leeches were the most widely used method of patient bleeding. Leech collectors were in high demand since leeches are parasitic worms that feed on the blood of their hosts. These workers used to enter ponds packed with leeches and guide the little suckers into buckets, thus this job pretty much lives up to its name. Bloodletting, which involved the use of leeches, was once thought to be a kind of universal treatment for illness and infection. Leeches were so widely used in Europe that by the 18th century, they were practically extinct in Ireland, Wales, the Netherlands, and England. This would have been unfortunate because surgeons still employ leeches today. Personally, getting paid to eat food doesn't sound too bad. But when the title's food poison taster? Royal kitchens were food factories, pumping out hundreds of meals a day as servants trudged in and out. With such an unsettling number of hands touching his food, what steps did a royal take to avoid ingesting poison? Since the advent of kings and queens, poison tasters were hired to taste a noble's food for poison placed there by enemies. According to Maimonides, it was preferable if the taster, or a host whom the king suspected of unkindly intentions toward him, took a great heaping helping of the food rather than a polite nibble. To prevent the poisoning of his hard-won son and heir, the future Edward VI, Henry VIII had tasters stuff their faces with the young prince's milk, bread, meat, eggs, and butter before the boy took so much as a spoonful. But tests were not only reserved for food and drink. Servants also kissed the king's tablecloth and seat cushion. If their lips didn't itch or swell, they assumed the items were poison-free. Probably not too surprisingly, this does exist to some extent today. Actually, at the Summer Olympics in 2008, mice tasted athletes' food to ensure it wasn't poisoned. Despite having a worse understanding of medical theory than the majority of contemporary 5-year-olds, medieval barbers in Europe did much more than just cut hair. They were also doctors, dentists, and general healers. Known as the barber surgeon, they would lance boils, employ leeches, apply heated cups, pluck out rotting teeth, and more. Every useful person was there, with the exception that there was no anesthesia, no sterile environment, and possibly even no equipment washing in between shots. Don't you think it would be fun to perform enema procedures in the squalor of the Middle Ages? The shrieking anguish of actually using pliers to pull teeth? Why on earth were the barbers acting in this manner? A papal decree stated that priests were not permitted to shed blood, so surgery was transferred to another, even less qualified field. It turns out that priests used to perform the majority of medical healing tasks. You're going to run into some pretty horrifying stories of torture and execution if you start reading about old customs. Executions were public affairs that were often days long, gory, and revolting. All that great jazz, death-by-minute cuts, being burned alive in metal balls, having limbs severed. Hell, it was rather typical to be slowly sawed in half. Priorities did not place mercy and quickness at the top of the list until at least the French Revolution. Consider the unfortunate person who has to clean up the mess. The person who has to dig the bones out of the foul water they were slowly drowned in and pick up the burnt chunks of human flesh. Who has to sift through the dirt, feces, and blood that come with human death. City dwellers know all too well how nasty rats can be. These gross, often disease-ridden pests were, and arguably are, still, a menace to society in the Victorian era. So, rat catchers would go to pubs and other public places, trap mice, and often entertain passers-by by doing tricks like grabbing as many rats as they could in one hand and let them crawl up and down their arms. That's it for today. Which of these is your favorite job?